why we think that climate change is a serious source of concern for crop production. Kind of answers, how can we assess its effect using experimental data like field trials or warming experiment or drying experiments, or with models. You won't see, you got to invite me all the time. So I think up to now, up to the early 2000s years, drought was considered as a minor phenomenon for crop production, except in so-called poor countries. We had a big drought in Sahel, for instance, associated with desertification in the 1980s. But surprisingly, Sahel has become wetter afterwards in the 1990s and the 2000s, unlike what was kind of expected in the beginning. But for the main production areas of staple food, like the US Corn Belt or the Chinese North China Plain or the European plains, drought was not an issue until this first event that shocked the US in 2012. You can see from this picture that all the areas marked in red note some kind of severe or extreme droughts. Extreme both by the intensity of the drought, so you have a very strong water deficit, and in general, in the mid-latitudes, droughts are associated both to less water, so you have less rainfall, but also higher temperature. You don't have, let's say, hot and wet at the same time, like it is the case in some regions in the tropics. So this event has affected a very large area of the crop production, 45% of corn and 35% of soy. And as a result, it resulted in a very sharp drop of yield during that year, something like 10% or more. And another interesting consequence of this event is that because the US is the main global producer of corn for export, so if you look at the corn export price, basically, it has a correlation of 0.7 with the US corn production. Other countries in Africa produce corn, but they don't export. They just consume it domestically. So indeed, this drop of yield was associated with a strong rise of commodities, agricultural commodities, in particular those that are related to corn. You see there is also an increase of milk, for instance, and eggs. That's because most of the corn is given to animals, but in particular to chickens. In Europe, I needed a translation early this morning, but this we have also been affected by, let's say, one very important drought in 2023, in particular in France and Switzerland. That was perhaps not so, let's say, warnful for crops, but for mortality. We had a lot of, old people died from heat. That was very extreme, and nobody had seen this kind of very long-standing exposure of people to heat in cities. But of course, drought in Europe become more frequent and more severe. In fact, Europe, if you look at the kind of climate charts, is one of the regions, in particular Western and Central Europe, where you have both an increase in the frequency, the kind of return period, and in the severity of droughts. And 2018 was particularly important for Central Europe, like Eastern Germany, Poland, and Southern Sweden. This region was affected because Eastern Germany actually is not very wet, right? I mean, most of the wetness comes from the ocean, so it's very wet in the UK, in Normandy, in Brittany. But as you move inland, there is precipitation, and the average level of precipitation in Berlin, for instance, or in Poland is not that high. It's slightly lower than in Paris, for instance. So all these droughts have different spatial and temporal footprints. You see here in red colors, regions where there is a high summer water deficit. 2003 was mainly a story of France, southern Germany, northern Italy, and Switzerland. You may also have heard about kind of mega drought that happened in Russia in 2010, mainly in the region of Moscow. 2015 was also a year where the drought was not as severe as two others, but it's very widespread. It's a kind of record low year for rainfall. And as you can see, it spreads from the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula almost to Ukraine and Russia, just saving Scandinavia. And 2018 is really a phenomenon that is affecting Scandinavia, Poland, Baltic countries, and Germany, much less in France, and it was indeed wetter in Spain. So those events are becoming more and more frequent. We have in France, for instance, if you look at the kind of water deficit index in 2022, that's the black curve. It hits basically a record of all the previous years in terms of record low water deficit observed during the kind of peak growing season for summer crops between July to almost the end of September. 23 was also a very warm year. If you look at the average temperature anomaly in France, you see that most of the pulses of abnormal heat compared to some reference period happen almost throughout the entire year, in particular also during the summer. And this problem is probably not likely to go away because 2003 was considered as a shock that under a stable climate should happen every 100 to 150 years. But of course, with the anthropogenic forcing of climate change by rising greenhouse gases concentration, we have more energy available for the planet. And what we see is that the tail of the temperature distribution is warming faster than the center of the distribution. So if you have a global warming, let's say of 2 degrees, the number of extremes are going to increase by more than this. And if you look at the latest summer temperature in France, 2023 was really hot. 2022 was similar. In terms of recurrence of those events during the historical period, like the last 30 years, those are really like 2 sigma kind of events, so they happen very rarely. If you look at climate projections for a moderate warming, because 2 degrees we are almost there, right? It becomes much more likely, like a 30%, 20 to 30% chance to have this every year. If you move on to a global warming level of 3 degrees, just a little bit warmer, you can see that events like those extreme summer droughts become normal, basically every 1 or 2 years. And we are particularly concerned by drought when it comes to crop yield because a lot of regions are sensitive to droughts, in particular the countries where you have crop production. And the scientific committee has been interested by the kind of storm of the century or a drought that would affect simultaneously different breadbasket regions of the planet. If you have a big drought in the US, but if China and Europe have no drought, you can still sustain crop production. Of course, you have all these trade mechanisms. But if you have in the same year, a very severe drought in India, in China, in the US, and in Europe, we may have a kind of severe shock for food security and food prices. You can see here how the effect of climate, I showed you before, the water deficit intensity for Europe is mirrored very clearly by the crop yields. These are crop yield data for administrative units from Eurostat for different crops, wheat, barley, and sugar beet. And roughly speaking, all the red areas denote yield anomalies, which are very high compared to the normal. So it means that even if we have some kind of technological society with sometimes irrigation, mechanization, and so on, we still have problems to sustain high crop yields during climate shocks. And you see also that in the Iberian Peninsula, you remember maybe from the previous slide that it was blue, it was wetter, and you had this year, let's say, a better yield in particular for winter cereals like wheat and barley. Drought is not the only problem. Some crops are extremely sensitive to very specific events like frost. Like wine, you know, if you have a little leaf present in early spring, then you have just a few days of temperature below zero during the night. Basically, it kills the plants, and you don't have any good grape harvest. That's why, for instance, vineyards have been lighting fires to try to prevent nighttime temperature to reach too low values. We are also concerned about flood because climate change doesn't come only with, let's say, more drought, but also with more variability in general. And we know from the previous years that in Europe, we have both an increase in droughts, but also an increase in floods. And for instance, after the flood of 2021, there was some concerns by EU countries that were affected by very large floods that in addition to the kind of disasters to property, it would eliminate or reduce the hope of a very successful harvest. So flood is particularly important in, let's say, regions that are subject to summer monsoon. That was the case, for instance, in Pakistan. Pakistan had an historically extremely severe drought. And you can see in the dark blue bars on the right how abnormal were the rainfall level every month for each region of Pakistan compared to the historic normal. We are really talking about very, very serious heavy rainfall, right? In Paris, the annual mean is 600 millimeters per year. And here you have some months where during 1 month it rains twice more, 1.2 meters in 1 month. And the previous month was also like 500 millimeters. And not surprisingly, this, heavy floods have been associated to crop yield losses and to damage. And of course, those countries have to rely on imports, and the price of food has increased at that time. So you have here some, examples of the economic loss in dollars for that particular event regarding rice, cotton, which are very commonly cultivated crops in Pakistan, as well as sugar cane. And the kind of food inflation has been increased as this particular drought has progressed. So as a conceptual model, you have those adverse weather events like frost, like drought, like floods, and you expect from them some loss of production. And let's say production is a problem, but the real problem is price, right? And generally speaking, when you have a loss of production, you have an increase in price. But you have some amplification mechanisms, because when countries start to say, well, we are going to have a disaster, we are going to have less food for ourselves, exporting countries, generally they ban export. They say, okay, we're not going to export crops this year. This gives a signal to the market, and of course, the food price rises. And then as the food price rises, you have more tendency for countries to say, well, we are going to stop the exports more. And if you stop the export, you have speculation, and people buy in advance on market the main staple commodities, and it contributes again to increase prices, right? And that's what happened during those crises. We had an interesting event, which is the just most recent El Nino. So El Nino is a recurrent phenomenon that is interesting for crop because it comes with a kind of atmospheric teleconnection patterns that bring drought in most of the tropical regions, although some regions are also wetter. Like typically the canonical pattern of El Nino is that it's dry over the Amazon, it's dry over Asia, it's sometimes dry over India, and it's a bit wetter, for instance, in the United States. So this El Nino started with a warm temperature that then led to lower rainfall in the tropics. And if you look at the kind of synthesis impact of how El Nino affects crop yields, of course, El Nino has a big effect on the Amazon tropical rainforest, but there is not much crop there. So the main regions that are affected are those breadbasket, like in southern Brazil, also in South Africa and Sahel, and that particular year in India, right? Little bit less in China. So because India is a very large country, if they have drought, what they do is that they say, okay, we are going to, they produce rice, of course, and what they did is that they banned the export of rice. They say non-basmati rice because basmati rice is very expensive, a lot of resources. So in the last resort, they would keep the basmati rice for themselves, but of course they would have to sell it on the market. And as the Indian ban was announced, of course, other countries follow because they say, well, you know, there is going to be you have speculations, and other exporters like Vietnam or Thailand rise their prices. And you can see how, let's say, a regional effect has led to basically a global increase of the price of rice, which is very important for importing countries. Another thing that climate change is changing is not only the amount of crop, but the quality of crops. And we did some nice work with David and colleagues and the Chinese colleagues. We were interested not in the amount of rice, but the quality of rice, in particular in Japan. Japan is producing rice, maybe for self-consumption, right? It's not a big rice producer. And they produce very high quality rice for sushi. Huh? And the high quality rice in Japan is measured by the degree of chalkiness. So I'm not an expert of that, but you look at the grain, if it is transparent and if it is mechanically strong, it's expensive and it's very good quality to produce sushi. And basically we found from data across about 70 prefectures that there is basically a decrease of rice quality. It's still good to eat. It's not a problem for nutrition. It's just a problem for, you know, the taste maybe and the preparation of the food, that you have this kind of white inclusion that are emerging in the rice. And those are, we found that are very strongly connected to nighttime temperature a few months before harvest. So if you have very hot nights, it leads to decrease the quality of the rice. And we found that in Japan, the quality of the rice has been stable, but it decreased significantly. And you have some prefectures where it decreased more. In China, the rice quality is not measured with the same indicator. I think it's a kind of mill kernel quality. So they harvest the rice, they mill it, and after the milling, the quality is considered optimal if the kind of milled grain length is at least 75% of the original, like, maximum grain length. Basically, if the grain are broken, they have a lower quality. Again, it's not a big problem for nutrition, it's a problem for quality. And you can see that everywhere in China, let's say first grade rice has decreased in quality, and that can be very well related, and they can be related using statistical models to the effect of climate change. Other effects that are perhaps less well understood, but I believe very important, are the effect of pathogens in general and pests, which are also very sensitive to climate. This is an example for this, what we call in French, mouche orientale. It's called Bactrocera dorsalis. It's an insect that is attacking fruits. So basically, when you have the insects, you have to put more pesticides, or you have less harvest of important food crops. They are very widespread in India, in China, in Indonesia, and all over Africa. But as you can see, they have a range which is basically controlled by temperature. It's a tropical insect. And they start to be observed and present in Italy now. And probably, if you look at studies that have made some kind of niche model to look at the future range of those insects that are very important for crops, they are very likely to be present over very large areas up to Poland and north of France, for instance, in the future. And of course, those indirect effects of climate change are important. If you look at the change itself, back in the 80s, climate-related disasters were relatively low. We had, I think, on average during a decade, something like 150 climate disasters. The amount has more than doubled during the decade of the 2004-14, and everything, including, you know, property damage for hurricanes and crop yields. The amount of damage for the society has also increased much more dramatically, from 14 billion per year to like 100 billion per year. Yeah, and if you look at the sectors that are most impacted by climate change, according to the FAO, it's mainly crops, but also livestock. I will not speak much about livestock, but livestock is basically, a lot of it is raised in barns, but there are a lot of issues about heat stress because the animals are optimized to a certain maximum temperature. Of course, it's a maximum summer temperature. They're like humans. There's problems to actually heat by transpiration. And basically, the issue for livestock is, do we have enough, let's say, breeding reserves for having animals that are more tolerant to heat stress, because they have not been selected so far for their tolerance to very strong heat. So to give you still more concrete examples here, I want to take 3 examples. The first one is wheat in France in 2016. That was really, let's say, a surprise, because wheat yield has been increasing a lot in France. People around here, they harvest something like 10 tons per hectare, so it's a big harvest. But still, it has stagnated. We don't really know why. We think it's partly because of climate change, partly because of reduction of fertilizers, perhaps some less progress in breeding. But 2015 was really a shock that was completely crazy. In all these breadbasket counties of France, we had a loss of 40% of harvest, so it was really something unique. And what is more important is that nobody had seen it coming. You have a big forecast system in GRC, in ISPRA. They use satellite data, they use weather data, they update the prediction. Then they have experts, you know, the super wheat experts are making some predictions. And just a few days before the harvest, we say 15 days before the harvest, they say, no, it will be a normal year. And then everything comes off. So why it was not predicted? Because most of the models look at things that they know, like spring drought, flowering problem, drought just before harvest, problems. But what is unexpected is that in this year, we had a constellation of conditions that were never observed before. We had a very warm month of November and December, and we had a super wet month of May with some flooding in the Seine River. And if you try to model the probability of yield loss, which is what we did in the paper, we found that under just one condition, like a very wet spring, no problem for yield loss. But if you have both warm winter and wet spring, then you have a severe loss. And of course, prediction models, they just look at one data at a time. The causes of wheat loss can still be complex because it's not just one factor. If you look at the grain number at field stations, the grain number decreased, but you can see across the same breadbasket, you have still a large variability. And it was explained mainly by the low radiation during the flowering period in May. On the other hand, the grain size was also smaller. So not only the number was less, but the size of each grain was smaller for wheat. And this was statistically explained by waterlogged soils, basically anoxia in the root zone. And in the end, the final green yield was explained both by the rainfall, but also by the appearance of disease. And in fact, this big rain, they cause direct damage, they reduce the radiation, but they bring some fusarium fungi, and the farmers cannot go in the field because it's soaking wet, there is mud, so they cannot process and put sanitary products. And that's a second reason why the yield has been less. So it's an interesting thing because even though we are kind of technological society with the high yields, we didn't see it coming, and it was quite important. Second short example, the vineyards in France, I already mentioned it, but it's a nice one. We had this below freezing temperatures in important vineyard regions in 2021, just a few days, but it was enough to create a big damage. So, a few days of extreme climate can, for instance, according to the FNSEA, which is the main union of farmers, has lost, like 1/3 of the wine harvest. And what we found here is an interesting, again, constellation of effect, is that normally the spring is warmer and warmer. So most of the plants, they follow it. Phenology has a high plasticity. So they put the leaf earlier and earlier, which means that when they have the leaf on, if you have a frost day, then they die. Before, you had a kind of barrier because the spring was not so warm. So they put the leaf. That although the global minimum temperature after the kind of early spring has increased, the risk of frost during the leafy period has increased because the minimum temperature experienced during the leaf-on period has in fact decreased, because it's a race between the plants are putting their leaf earlier and then the frost is coming later. But of course, if they don't completely parallel each other, you have basically more exposure because you have fresh young leaves that are vulnerable and you still have late spring drought. That's an important effect. Last event, 2018 drought, already showed you very high loss of yield, up to 40% in Central Europe, with record temperature. So that's wheat, and the orge is the barley. Yeah, so this is basically a story of, it's a more common one related to the combination of heat and water stress. And yes, should I stop here, maybe?
Another 5 minutes.
Okay. So practical questions, of course. What is the impact on average? Are there some winners and losers in this? And can we adapt farming practice to climate change? So for the last question, we did a meta-analysis of model simulations and field trials, where they have paired sites with and without adaptation. Adaptation can be many things: fertilizer, changing the species, irrigation, of course, is very important in the face of drought. And then we made a kind of global upscaling model of what would be the yield with and without adaptation. And we found that with current adaptation, let's say empirical evidence, indeed adaptation has the potential to mitigate a lot of the yield shocks. But you don't have only bad news. In principle, some people say, well, CO2 is increasing. It's a good news for plants because it increases carboxylation rates. In fact, the VC max is decreased, but the overall photosynthetic leaf level uptake is increased. And because you have a direct CO2 effect on plant growth, you may think that it will increase at least photosynthesis. And down the pipe of photosynthesis, why not carbon allocation to grain and leaves? And in fact, all the future scenarios come up with a higher CO2. The problem is that increased photosynthesis doesn't mean increased yield, right? You have a lot of things that come in between photosynthesis and yield formation. On the other hand, increase of temperature is coming with a shorter growing season. And that's a problem for wheat crops because they have very long growing season. Wheat is sown in October, it's harvested in July. A lot of things can happen and they need some time for maturation of grain. The same for corn in the US, if you don't have enough time of, relatively good days exposure from the flowering to the kernel formation and the grain harvest in November in the US, you have bad yields. So the increase of temperature is shortening the growing season and also the grain feeding season. That's a problem. Direct increase of temperature, of course, comes with a direct risk of heat stress. In principle, it's a lower risk of frost, except under some special circumstances. And in general, increase of temperature comes with more pests. And of course, generally, when you have high temperature, low water availability, and radiation, they come together. And they means that you have water requirements for plant transpiration, which are not necessarily fulfilled by available soil water. So you have all these effects that are actually very complex. And that's the reason why we have many research projects that try to look at the impact of climate change on agriculture. The main challenge for me is to really kind of separate the different factors, in particular those that are heavily correlated with each other, like radiation, water deficit, direct heat stress. And that requires, let's say, if you have to do an experimental plan with field trials, you need to isolate different factors to make many replicates. So that brings up, very expensive and also difficult experiments. If you add the breeding dimension, like you want also to test the resistance or the resilience of different varieties, it makes the kind of experiment design more complex. And that's the reason why we use models, right? Models are also not perfect, in particular in view of new situations like this wet basket failure in France that we have never seen before. So there are a lot of methodological questions which are, let's say, important and try to be addressed by the community, is how to assess the effect of climate change using direct experiments. And there is a lot of experiments where people are trying to warm using infrared heaters or open top chambers field. And most of these experiments, they provide a very convincing evidence that when you warm the crop artificially, you have a replicate, warm and controlled plot, the yield is always lower. And typically, all the experiments for the main staple food like wheat, rice, corn, they show a 10 to 15% decrease yield for 1 degree of already what we experienced in the last century. Then the second problem is how to realistically simulate the effect of climate change with mathematical models. Mathematical models, let's say, they can simulate hydrology, they can simulate to some extent water stress, but generally speaking, they don't include a very good representation of genotypes and varieties. So they have a generic type of wheat, but of course, in the real world, farmers are using very distinct varieties. And those models are not good at simulating very specific events like rain formation, flowering, impact of heat on flowering. So they have some very strong weak spots. And of course, you have a deluge of results, that is published, kind of journals that we have no time to read. And that's also the problem of how to synthesize all the results. So you can use GPT, of course, it's also a partial view of things. You can use your expert knowledge. We don't really have, we have the IPCC report, they have a section on crop yields, but the science is progressing very fastly. There are also some groups like EasyMeep or AgMeep that are trying to produce, let's say, platforms where you have synthesis of model experiments. And there is still, in my opinion, a little bit of a decoupling between the experiments and the models. The modelers are doing a lot of things. Experimentalists are also progressing, but how to bring them together is still an emerging issue. Yeah. I think I will stop there. Happy to.